Diablo 4 had its latest limited beta this past weekend, based primarily on trying to get as many people logging in to break their servers, and with the main in-game goal of killing the first world boss, Ashava, a significant 5 levels below its level, for a special mount trophy from Ashava to be unlocked in the final game. This beta weekend, dubbed the Server Slam, also boasted the balances Blizzard talked about in their Diablo 4 Open Beta Retrospective letter. So I did spend my time playing each class to the max of 20, running them all through the same dungeon for some thoughts on these changes, as well as killing Ashava a few times, each on different characters. I did nearly all the content on Tier 2, aside from a couple of Ashava kills, the first one being to guarantee getting the mount, and the second one when I was playing through cross-play party co-op with my wife who was on an Xbox Series X. Some changes can definitely be felt, some way more than others, both good and bad. The level cap was lower, so less skill points could be thrown around overall, so being able to diversify a build was rather lackluster, and this was felt in a couple of classes way more than others, and definitely made the beginning gameplay loop feel pretty bad for some of them. Anyways, let's get this next of probably at least one more Diablo 4 related videos from me on the way. Now, I'm positive that you've probably heard this information at least once before if you care about the game at all, or just happen to let your YouTube loop on random videos. So I will cover it briefly, but not in depth or coming up with any guesses to what it might mean for the future. Just, a bit of what my experiences were with these changes in the Server Slam beta. Overall, the gameplay loop in dungeons was improved. The need for backtracking in playable dungeons, in the Fractured Peaks of course, the playable area we had, was reduced. Also, the chance for events to spawn inside a dungeon was increased from a meager 10% to 60%. That was a massive increase, and I did come across a plethora of more events than I had in the prior beta period. I went from having maybe one in all of my experience in the dungeons to having one almost nearly every single dungeon, surprisingly. That is a massive increase. This added a great chance of variety, variety that I actually experienced when running the mini dungeons available to level through outside of the actual campaign, which we had access to in the Fractured Peaks. Other changes were just some quality of life changes. Interacting with objects in dungeons had that time reduced, so you didn't have to channel that interaction for nearly as long. When completing certain objectives, you were given a bit of your class resource, or healed, or a healing potion dropped upon the completion. The resource that was provided, I felt like was much more important to the Barbarian class, whereas just running around and completing these objectives, you did lose your resource, which you had to build up through combat. Fury. Just running around and trying to complete these objectives, that Fury drained, which felt really bad. Which I think does just help Barbarian feel really bad overall. Cellars, those literal holes in the ground, or the dilapidated shacks or buildings with the one room, saw a few changes that were great as well. Events spawned at an increased rate here, a nice and welcome change, making them worth running for the experience alone, as well as the chance of loot dropping from the mobs. In addition, chests now spawned upon completion, and I quote, consistently, end quote. I don't know what this consistently was supposed to mean, because in the prior beta period, I never had a single chest spawn in these cellars. While here, in the Server Slam, I had one in every single cellar, along with the events and the loot drops. It felt really nice being given a reward for taking the time to see what happened in these various cellars, and typically, it was just more spiders. Also, alongside these changes, various bosses were re-evaluated for melee character difficulty, but I don't think the right ones were evaluated. The Brood Guard, who I am fighting here on World Tier 2, at level 15 on my rogue, should have been one of the bosses re-evaluated, but it was not. As a ranged character, it's easy enough to dodge these spider webs, which instantly snare your character. On top of this, the spawned spider mobs also shoot out ensnaring webs and poison pools. And coupled with the poison pools from the boss, the exploding spider host minions, this fight is rather entirely unenjoyable as a melee character. It was unenjoyable in the open beta, it was just as unenjoyable in the Server Slam. bosses that were adjusted I never really had issues with before as a melee character. But this, the infinite mob spawning, the infinite possibility of snares, the snares that happen when you don't even make contact with the graphic of the web, the snares that just seem to occasionally happen, just out of nowhere. I shouldn't feel like I've accomplished some sort of end game feat by beating a beginning area spider boss. There's definitely still a lot of balancing to be done for melee characters in Diablo 4. And like I said, plus the hitboxes for these webs were just awful, and the hitboxes in general from some enemies spawned world interactables are just awful to begin with. So this sort of balancing for melee characters still needs some heavy consideration and re-evaluation. Other changes: incapacitating effects that could be applied to elite monsters. Well, they applied for twice as long before they become unstoppable to those effects. So this means your chill to freeze, anything like that, stuns, knockdowns, easier. They're just as easy to apply. They last twice as long, and then they become unstoppable. Many legendary powers also were given a boost to their effectiveness, or just nerfs as well. The one revolving around Blood Mist and Corpse Explosion received a nerf, though I never messed around with that one in either the open beta or the server slam, so no idea on that's actual effectiveness, but they did some basic legendary balancing. There wasn't a huge amount of drop legendaries to try out, unlike in the open beta where they were on a huge increased drop rate on the loot table. I had a couple here and there of various classes, but most of the time, if I had them, it was just from any aspects I found in dungeons, or it was from completing the Act 1 mission, the conclusion to the Act 1 mission that you get in the beta. So with that, let's move on to the specific classes themselves and kind of how they felt, much like with my prior video. I'll just be going over them in order of worst to best, and this is purely based on my experience, no actual real farming or anything like that, no legendary seeking. Just when I got to 20, I did the stronghold and I did the dungeon. So didn't move too much, but coming in last place with how I felt the class was in a position to be viable in all content. And I guess it's not really all content, this is just in the early game how much fun it is on its playability, which is really important if you want to keep players to stick around. The Barbarian, so it did fall one spot where I had it in 4th last time we played the game in the open beta. The Barbarian did have a few changes done. A flat 10% damage reduction had been added to the class across the board. However, with this, they did nerf various skill tree points to provide less resistance overall, and I did not like this. I liked using my skill points into those passive points for extra defense and damage reduction on top of the thorns and the fortify that you could receive from the various skills. I felt like overall this 10% was just a worse change. Honestly, I didn't feel any more tankier than before. I did just feel worse off. One of the great changes though, Whirlwind did more damage at the cost though of more fury, which didn't feel terrible, honestly. It felt fine, particularly in larger groups of enemies where you were pretty much refunded that 25 fury that you were spending per second on Whirlwind, just getting it back. So as the enemy count dwindled, your ability to sustain Whirlwind dwindled, but that also meant you were killing off the mobs you were attacking. So it did feel awful against a single enemy. Double Swing, however, was buffed. When enhanced, it refunded all of its fury cost when it hit a stunned or knockdown enemy. So this was good when you're using the Bull Rush skill. Overall, Barbarian just felt the most underwhelming now. You charge into battle with no resource, no fury. You need to get into melee range and hit enemies, resulting in you being hit before you start generating your resource, typically. Unless you took Leap and, the enhancer to get 40 fury off the bat when it hits, but there's your movement gone. Your movement's no longer being used for evade. I ended up having to run both Bull Rush and Leap just to have any sort of extra evade outside of your actual evade dash. So I think I did realize why I figured out Barbarian was so bad and why it felt so bad, though. The class is just so reliant on its basic skill, and then its underwhelming primary skills. I don't know how else to put that. I mean, the first core skill you get, and then your next two unlocks are yelling or movement. You have some defensives, iron skin, debilitating shout, stuff like that, stuff that boosts your defense. And the next tree branch, the next branch in the skill tree is either one of your two movements, leap or bull rush, or you have rallying cry and one other, maybe? I can't remember. But it just feels bad. You don't get the next damage dealing ability, outside of maybe, I guess, leap and bull rush technically deal a little bit of damage. You don't get your next damaging ability, such as rupture or death blow, until that fourth tree spot. And that just feels really, really, really bad. I did not like it at all. So yeah, at level 18 you're getting that next damage skill, which Deathblow you can chain relatively easy back to back to back, but you're waiting a long time to feel like you're doing any sort of damage as a Barbarian consistently. The Thorns passives were effectively nerfed with that increase of 10% across the board, so you were getting less from those specific passives. So if that's something you were trying to do, well, too bad. You got a nerf there. The Barbarian to me just felt bad. It was wholly unfun, which is a shame, because in the early minutes of a game, you want the player to be having just as much fun as they would in the late game. You want those early skills to be as impactful as those late skills that they're building upon to challenge more challenging content, where they do need that extra movement ability to get out of danger, to reposition, to not die, to be able to do more damage. That's just not there on the Barbarian. Nothing takes away from that power fantasy of being a hulking, powerful Barbarian, such as your third and fourth skill, doing nothing aside from just potentially yelling at an enemy. So, yeah. This is currently evocative of the final game as well, as the legendaries weren't dropping in the open beta, so you couldn't supplement this poor tree layout with these aspects that you'd be having. Now, honestly, playing as the Barbarian, it just kind of feels like you're an angry old man yelling at the goatman, waiting for his painkillers to kick into effect so he can get a little bit of a rage boner to go kill something. And now, next up, we have the farthest falling character here, the Necromancer. And the Necromancer feels like it was hit hard. Now, I didn't use the Blood Mist aspect nonsense to blow up corpses in the first beta. I just did run with skeletons and corpse explosions, you know, the actual Necromancer fantasy of raising the dead to fight for yourself. So, that sort of build was hit hard, and it was hit hard. Your summoned minions felt like they were as strong as single-ply toilet paper you would find at a seedy truck stop. You spent most of your time constantly resummoning them. You can't heal them at all either. They just remain at low health. If you do have all of your minions out, your priest doesn't heal them. Your priest just strengthens them. It's only useful if you're in combat. That might be a good change to have if you're out of combat, or just let the priest heal them. That would be a much better solution. So if you want to use minions, you pretty much need to use any and all attacks that will leave a corpse behind, as well as the Reaper minions for the Skeletal Warriors, so they can leave more corpses behind, because you're going to be needing those corpses a lot, and you're not going to be blowing them up with Corpse Explosion, you're going to be consuming them to re-summon. I don't think the longevity of the minions was the issue. Their health was fine. Just make them deal less damage. No need to knock them off from every, large enemy attack or elite enemy attack or every single boss attack. They were wholly useless in a Shava. They were useless in any sort of boss fight. You were constantly running out of corpses. It was bad. Now, I did play before they hotfixed the minions on the server's end. I did my Necromancer the first night that it was over, because it was one of the ones I wanted to try to see how the nerfs went to the minions, and it was bad. So, this is before that hotfix came through, so I'm unaware of how the Necromancer felt after said hotfix, but it was so bad that I started playing as a Necromancer with no minions at all, and I just didn't feel like a Necromancer. Now, the minions, despite having a health nerf, did receive buffs to all of their passive stats, so I guess that was what they thought would balance it out. But if they're not alive to use those, you know, increased numbers on those passives, like, what's the point of not just sacrificing them? So, yeah. Their damage output should have just been lowered for anything besides maybe the Reapers, who have that one strong attack every few seconds. But yeah, most of the time you just spent resummoning your skelly boys and girls. Your mages lived a little bit longer because they weren't in melee range of everything, but they still died in one hit to everything. So the bonus for sacrificing the minions was increased, but it just didn't make me feel like a Necromancer. So rocking a shield, using the Reapers for the extra carved out corpses, and just hoping I had enough corpses around to resummon them as I needed is kind of what I went with, using various bone spells, bone splinters, bone spear, all of the minion bonuses. They still were extremely, extremely weak. I wanted an army of the dead, damn it. And all I did was get an army of the resummoning of the re-dead. So the Necromancer, who I thought was one of the top choices in the open beta, has definitely fallen, and their kit needs another look at just because it was nerfed wholly incorrectly, I believe. Now, moving up a couple spots, the second highest mover, and I'm really just tied for the highest movement, I think, in how I thought the classes played, was the Druid. The Druid got a nice buff across the board, quite a few changes. While it still does definitely take a lot of experimentation and some fine-tuning to make something effective to play, it doesn't mean it's not fun to play. I still felt like, while beefy, the Werebarrel wasn't just offensively as viable as, say, the Werewolf or running Earth or Storm Magic, but you were at least beefy and had a ton of health, so there was that going for it. And having the lack of any real movement skills does really hurt the class, I think, as well, because a lot of stuff you just need to get out of the way from, and all the earth shields and cyclone armors and fortifies and barriers won't save you from a Shava. I tried to see what the capabilities of stacking defense on defensive barrier on barriers would be, and a Shava still just annihilated you through anything. Aside from the little bubble health. The little bubble saved you quite a few times, so that's about it. So having to solely rely upon boots with an extra evade charge, unless you want to take the crappy Werebear charge skill, it's pretty much what you're going to need to do as a Druid. There's no sort of like dash utilizing wind or tunneling using earth or anything involving werewolf movement. It's just you turn into a werebear and you charge and become unstoppable. So you still take damage, you just can't be stopped. It's something. It's not nearly as good as the rogue dash or the teleport from the Sorcerer, and hell, even the leap from the Barbarian is better. The Necromancer Blood Mist is better because you become invulnerable for that 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds, I can't remember. Werebear still just completely last place in any sort of movement. So if you are using any sort of storm skills, if you're using the wind or the lightning storm skills or earth skills or werewolf skills, it just kind of breaks that immersion of being a druid of nature, a druid of the earth, a werewolf. You turn into a werebear and you charge. That's that. I feel like it's really bad. Aside from this gripe that I still have, the Druid was a class that realized the most love from Blizzard with buffs between the open beta and the server slam, and probably the final game. There was not a single nerf, it was all buffs across the board. Firstly, companions were nothing but outrageously awful in the open beta. The wolves, the poison creeper, and the ravens provided nearly nothing passively, and even nothing when you activated their abilities. They were insanely undertuned. Insanely. It's like they shipped it with numbers for a different game. It was awful. So, Blizzard went through and tuned the activated abilities of these companions, and I think they overtuned them a bit. Wolves nuke down a single enemy. Ravens deal high AoE damage over time, while making enemies inside of their AoE area vulnerable, which works really well with most skills. The Poison Creeper immobilizes still, however the poison damage it applies is massive that it does over time. The activated abilities felt fantastic, however the elephant in the room, or lack thereof, is that the passives of the companions are still absolute garbage. There's like not really a reason for them to be there aside from taking up screen space. Like, oh yeah, I have some wolves I can use. I mean, at that point, just let the wolves call in. You have some passives that cost resources to summon, like the Hydra for the Sorcerer, which does more damage. You have the skeletons for the Necromancer, which does more damage. Thorns damage on the Barbarian does more damage than 2 wolves tearing at something's throat. The passives are absolutely awful. The activated abilities, too fantastic, too good. You would nuke screens of enemies or nuke bosses down every few seconds when you could activate those companion activated abilities. Maul and Pulverize on the Werebear also got a few buffs and usability improvements, so I can feel a little bit more better. Some damage increases, AoE increases. Not entirely sure what other changes were made. Maybe a resource cost reduction on Pulverize, because I do distinctly remember, as a Werebear previously, you could Pulverize once, and that was it. So, yeah, overall the Druid did get some really, really good changes, and just a lack of some changes elsewhere. When playing through as the Druid this time around, I played with a few builds. I went back to kind of like a Storm Earth hybrid, utilizing Storm Strike, Chain Lightning, Earth Pillars, Earth Shield, and then going along with the Ravens. That vulnerable stack was really, really nice when calling down your Chain Lightning. The Werewolf Poisoning was fantastic. There was a bug though when rabies wouldn't correctly be applied to enemies larger than the character, I guess, but they were aware of that. So overall, going with a Werewolf Poison melee build, fantastic. That's how I beat a Shaman on the Druid. It felt really good. Just needing that extra evade charge on your boots feels really bad. I feel like all the classes should have multiple types of movement abilities, or at least one good one, because, you know, some things like the Necromancer just don't have any at all. So overall, Druid felt fantastic. It was the class I was most looking forward to when Diablo 4 was announced and the Druid was announced, so it's good to see that it's back in a better place where I'm not having to hunt down 12 legendaries to make something minimally viable in comparison to like a Sorcerer who had nothing. And coming in second place, down from its top spot last time, I have the Sorcerer. And this might be just due to personal bias. As when using a caster, I really like lightning. I go for lightning usually, and then cold if it's not there. So cold was a good backup. Using a mixture of cold and fire was fun, but the lightning nerfs were definitely felt. You would no longer just clear a room upon entering with chain lightning or charged bolt. So yeah, well, charged bolt, I guess, received just the damage increase and mana cost decrease. The basic attack where you launch it, whatever it is. Crackling bolt? Crackling lightning? I don't know. Overall, lightning did receive a hefty nerf. This was primarily when dealing with single targets such as bosses, so I did notice some bosses died slower when bouncing that chain lightning back and forth, but it still made a joke of most enemies in the game. You're out of melee danger, you had teleport, you had barrier, you had multiple ways to apply barriers. Still, the Sorcerer is still highly overpowered, in my opinion. Fire skills did receive various buffs across the board through their enchantments, the specialization skill thing for the Sorcerer, so that was nice. Incinerate had a cooldown applied, a cooldown reduction, so a buff to its enchantment bonus, the flame spewing Hydra that would spawn. Firewall increased more spawns underneath enemies when you have that in your enchantment slot. And Meteor also had a boost to its lucky hits chance. So across the board, mostly buffs for the Sorcerer, minus a few lightning skills. Now, with the lightning nerfs, I did, like I said, branch out and try a few different other spell builds. So I was using like Ice Bolt, Hydra, Blizzard, and Fireball, and it still felt really, really good. Chilling, freezing enemies, and then lighting them on fire for extra dot damage on top of all of the impact damage the spells did felt really, really good. Now, the Hydra's damage was down. Don't know if initially that was a bug with how the Hydra was applying its damage in the open beta, but it was significantly down. However, for the 10 or 20 mana it costs, it was still, I believe, improper to not use a Hydra in your build, because that's just free damage. That's just free damage, and you could, while you run around and evade stuff, that's just free damage on the field. You can't skip that. The barriers on the Sorcerer, still extremely strong. Still the best damage, essential damage reduction in the game. It's just free extra life on top of your health that you get back every time you cast your barrier or proc one of the things that provide you a barrier. So between having the aspect which gave you a barrier on the hit of an enemy, having the ice barrier spell, as well as a few things on when casting a mana consuming spell to give you a barrier, you're nigh unkillable still. Teleport's still the best evasive movement skill in the game, even if there is still only one charge for it. So that still stands on top. You know, you have either cooldown reduction on it, you have reduced damage after you land for a few seconds, or, you know, just damage to enemies in general if you teleport in the middle of them. I mean, you might be doing that if you're using the Arc Lash skill, you know, a melee sorcerer, but teleport's still overall the best one. Less movement skill in the game, so yeah. While my Raiden from Mortal Kombat Power Fantasy Sorcerer is out, you can definitely still build a perfectly and fun, extremely damaging, battlefield controlling Shadow Todoroki build. So you can have if you have a Shadow Todoroki fantasy, you can still be a fire and ice mage quite successfully in Diablo. And this is all before any other potential nerfs or buffs elsewhere in the game before launch. And lastly here of my impressions of the classes themselves, I have the Rogue coming in as my favorite, and I think the overall most powerful for various reasons here from the Service Slam. Last time through I rated it as mid, and that was based on my usage of it in Melee. It was by far the best feeling Melee class to play in the open beta, and it remains the best Melee class to play for numerous reasons. So once again, I went with a Melee Rogue. I just really want to make Melee work so badly in this game. And it's really hard because it's just so much more difficult than being a ranged character. Plus, most of the rogues you come across in game were just using their bows anyways, so it felt like nice being the odd rogue out at times, running around with my stinky trash title, whatever I had. Overall, the rogue got some buffs to the subterfuge skill bonuses, so that was nice. Various passive skills got bonuses and buffs as well. The only real nerfs came to their imbuement skills, so imbue poison, shadow, and cold. So longer cooldowns, which really didn't affect me too much at all. It didn't really spam them in the last one because I was using combo points, so just utilizing my combo points correctly, I made my shadow imbuement was up whenever I needed it. Whenever I wanted to use twisting blades twice, I had my shadow imbuement up. So yeah, running combo points feels really, really good as a melee rogue. 1, 2, 3 basic attacks, twisting shadow imbuement, twisting blades, 1, 2, 3 attacks, twisting blades. There you go. You have your imbuement skill up again. Don't know if there's a difference between cooldown times of the other imbuements. I just know how it was for shadow imbuement. Still, the damage output on the rogue is absolutely massive. The activation of Twisting Blades, the double stab, is still super powerful. Even more powerful if you have it imbued. The boomerang of the blades back to you is still super powerful. Even more powerful if it's imbued. And imbued with Shadow and the various Shadow buffs I had available, to where enemies killed by Shadow would explode in AoEs of Shadow explosions, entire groups of mobs would just explode into a giant purpley haze, and it was fantastic, even against large elite enemies or bosses. Twisting Blades was still fantastic. You get the damage on the blades going in, you get damage on the blades returning. So you're not really missing out on much damage from there at all. You're still getting the same damage from those bosses. The only part that could be considered difficult, I think, about a melee rogue is still the positioning if you're fighting large groups of enemies, because if you're using Twisting Blades, you don't want to be able to position on the other side of the most enemies as possible to get that extra damage from the boomerang effect of the blades going back. So with that and the passives that exploded the enemies on death from your shadow, you could clear out just rooms of enemies. So having 2 charges of dash was fantastic. And having 2 charges of evade from boots also was fantastic. Having 4 different movement skills or abilities, one that did damage and travel great distances, one that just allowed you to avoid some damage. Fantastic. It felt fantastic to use. While I want the Druid to be my favorite class, while it probably will be, I think realistically it's probably going to be the Rogue, just because the playstyle loop is so much more fun. Stunning enemies with the Smoke Bomb, still great. Still allows you to get away from them if you need, increase your resources, increase damage against them because they're stunned. Everything about the Rogue kit is just fantastic. I didn't play around with the ranged Rogue this time through, but there weren't really any changes of that either, so that's still going to be super strong. Like I said, overall, the melee Rogue is just an absolute blast to play. Except, of course, on a few bosses. The intro video I had here in the background when I started up this overall video was me fighting the Brood Guard on my level 15 Rogue at the time. So I was missing Shadow Imbuement to use, combo points, etc. That's one of those bosses that really needed rebalancing for melee characters, because it is an absolute chore. You spend most of the time dodging around spiderwebs on the ground with bad hitboxes, invisible spiderwebs, which just end up snaring you in poison pits. It is awful. So, while the melee rogue is still the best melee character, and it's my favorite to play, in some situations, such as with that Brood Guard, compared to playing on it as when I did my Sorcerer, it was just an awful experience. I felt like I was fighting an endgame boss on a level 15 enemy on World 2 in just a dungeon, just a random fucking dungeon. One of the first dungeons you can come across. I think, in fact, if you're just following a path, that is the first dungeon you will come across in the game. It shouldn't be that way. It really shouldn't be that way. I expect that sort of challenge maybe on tier 3, but even then you'll have gear and you'll be built out by doing a capstone dungeon. Melee still just needs a lot of work. So, yeah, overall, Melee Rogue was still my favorite class to play, but not necessarily the class I want to play the most, which would be the Druid. But yeah, just with my experiences, doing a Shava, doing multiple dungeons, doing the crawl through the Karska Stronghold dungeon, which was playing here in the background. Still just the best class to play overall, especially if you want to do melee, but just the most fun I had overall with any of the classes. Overall, I feel like the balances were all over the place as we come away from the Server Slam weekend. The Barbarian to me just feels worse with many of its passives just being nerfed to the ground based on damage reduction because of that flat damage reduction that was added. The Necromancer minions felt awful to use, and if I ever do play one, I'll just look at getting those passive bonuses for sacrificing the minions instead, but even then, that's not fulfilling, the Necromancer fantasy of raising an army of the dead to do your business. And those skeletons just die like a house of cards as a slight breeze blows by. While receiving nerfs to its lightning, the Sorcerer still felt great to play. Lightning was still extremely powerful and viable. However, I think this just allowed people who are a fan of casting classes, arcane casters, to try a few different builds using fire and ice, or a combination of all of them. The Druid changes overall were very positive and seem a bit overpowered to the companions, though still extremely underwhelming in any sort of movement utility. The Rogue, the one nerf to the Rogue didn't really feel like a nerf to me just because of my playstyle using the Rogue anyways. You know, using the combo points, get 3 combo points, imbue, twisting blades, 3 combo points, imbue, twisting blades, position, maybe a twisting blades without imbuement, but by that point imbuement's usually up. Still felt amazing and just tops overall for me. Anyways, I think with the overall changes, I'll probably be picking this up once again. I did play through on the Druid with my wife. She was on her Series X, and I was here on my PC, and it was really fun. There were no server issues like we had last time or attempted to do during the open beta, so it was overall a blast to play through that. Helped her get her Ashava kill, got her to level 20 for the Wolf Companion, so that was all fun. I think I will probably be doing just a Rogue and a Druid, I think, as I go through. I'll do a Druid when I'm playing through with her, and I'll just have a Rogue I blast through on my own. It'll be fun. Looking forward to the seasonal content. Diablo 3 seasons or something, I played with her quite a while we were doing it on our Switch. This will be a bit different. Diablo 4 is not on the Switch, so she's unsure if she wants it on her console or on her PC as well, but that'll be something to figure out in the future. But anyways, those are my thoughts on this server slam and the few changes we did get between the Open 4 from that retrospective letter that they listed all the changes they were making. We'll see what other changes they have coming forward. It seems like they really do want to make Diablo 4 succeed. It seems like they, overall, Blizzard has turned over kind of at least from appearances a new leaf there with what they're doing with World of Warcraft and now Diablo 4. Overwatch 2 is still their just money-hungry cash cow, but thanks for sticking around. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and go ahead and like and subscribe for whatever else I might put out there.